All right, welcome, bienvenidos. I'm Rob Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and I'm so glad that you're here for Tertulia Histórica. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Rick Hendricks. He has been an editor at the Vargas Project. He's a former state historian, and currently he's the state records administrator right here in Santa Fe. And today he will be talking to you about New Mexico's road to statehood. So please welcome Rick Hendricks.
Thank you, Rob. Some of you may be wondering why we were talking about statehood in 2025. Well, guess what? We just discovered that New Mexico had become a state, so we thought we would talk about it. Actually, every year on January 6th, we celebrate the fact that New Mexico had become a state. The former deputy state historian, Nicolás Chavez, asked me to give this presentation because in 2012, I gave this presentation 30 times. There was a lot of interest in statehood that year. Rob had not joined the staff at that point, and so quite a few people were interested in this story. So let's go to the next slide. So I like to start the story of statehood with the concept of manifest destiny. Most of you are familiar with the idea that that had taken hold in this country in the 1840s, that the people of the United States had a God-given right to control the country from ocean to ocean, and this was seen in the westward movement of people. Of course, gold was discovered in California, which was a big attraction to pull people west. So that's where I like to start the story. You could start it in a number of different places. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about people that were involved, that were important in the story, and some of the key events, and try to run through this fairly quickly. Stephen Watts Kearny led the U.S. invasion of New Mexico. So from 1846, when this starts, by that point, New Mexico is really now on the road to eventually becoming part of the United States, and will become first a territory, then a state. So Kearny comes in 46. There's a war with Mexico. New Mexico, of course, was part of Mexico at that point. Let's go to the next slide. And of course, the first really important event that changes the character of New Mexico is the result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the war between the United States and Mexico. And one of the outcomes of that is that not quite half of what had been the Mexican national territory in the far north has been seized by the United States. And there were a number of provisions of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that have an impact on New Mexico. Let's go to the next slide. In particular, I want to look at the nature of citizenship of the people of New Mexico as outlined in Article 9. Now, when the treaty was first negotiated, the text of the treaty said that the people of the Mexican territory of New Mexico would become citizens of the United States as soon as possible. It went through another modification when the United States started the process in Congress of ratifying the treaty, and it was changed to at the proper time, and then eventually it was changed again to read as determined by Congress. So what was negotiated with, at the conclusion of the war with Mexico, and what actually happened to the citizens of New Mexico was a very different situation. And so what you actually had as after the treaty, you had a lot of people, a fairly considerable number of people left New Mexico, moved to Mexico to a number of colonies that were called military colonies in the northern state of Chihuahua. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a map of the land that was ceded by the treaty. You can see that only half of New Mexico is included in this, and that was because, well, you can't see that actually. Now you can. Only half of New Mexico to the western bank of the Rio Grande was, there was no controversy over that, but as early as the 1820s, Texas, first as part of Mexico and then as independent, after it broke away in 1836, it claimed that Texas owned New Mexico to the eastern bank. So literally half of New Mexico belonged to Texas. Again, this was controversial, was not really well established, but there was no controversy that all of the rest of that, so half of New Mexico, all of present-day Arizona, part of Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, California, all of that came as part of the land cession to the United States as a result of the treaty. Let's go to the next slide. So the President of the United States, Zachary Taylor, was very much in favor of adding New Mexico as a state. So when California came in 1850 as a state, there was a discussion that the consideration that there had to be enough population in New Mexico, and there certainly was enough population. Taylor was in favor of it, and unfortunately, Taylor dies before that can come into effect, and then Millard Fillmore is not in favor of the statehood. And so let's go to the next slide. So New Mexico had passed a constitution in 1850. It was on the way to Washington to be examined by the Congress when Taylor died. It was an interesting document. It purported to be the will of the people of New Mexico, and one of the things it dealt with the slavery issue. The Constitution of 1850, there was not going to be any slavery in New Mexico, chattel slavery. There were some provisions to protect the Catholic Church. For example, priests didn't have to serve in the military. There were some things along those lines. But at any rate, this Constitution never came to be. Also in 1850, let's have the next slide. We have the Compromise of 1850. So New Mexico has become a pawn almost immediately when the United States grabs it. New Mexico has become a pawn in what's called a sectarian issue. And that is, as territories come into the United States or territories become states, will they be slave states or will they not be slave states? And so the Compromise of 1850 is actually a whole series of compromises. But one of the things that happens that's germane to our story is when New Mexico comes in, the language that is associated with it doesn't mention the slavery issue. It doesn't say whether it's going to be a free state or not. So that's how New Mexico comes in. Next slide. So the next step on the road is the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. Mexican government was bankrupt, and we wanted to acquire two things. At this time, Jefferson Davis, who becomes president of the Confederacy, is advocating from his position in Washington for the construction of an intercontinental railroad across the South. The idea would be to link the southern states with a port in California. And the other thing is that there were significant copper deposits in this area, and the United States wanted to acquire this. So this was a purchase from Mexico of this territory, and this brings the area that for the next decade will be New Mexico and Arizona as one territory. Let's go to the next slide. So governors were appointed out of Washington at this point for the territory, and Otero was actually a Southern sympathizer. And so in his period, he adopted a slave code, which we had here for black chattel slavery in New Mexico. It reversed basically the anti-slavery resolutions, what had been in the unsuccessful Constitution, and again was a reflection of his own Southern sympathy. So let's go to the next slide. Well, New Mexico is caught up in the Civil War, again because the Southern states are desirous of having access to warm water ports in California. And what happens here is basically Texas invades New Mexico. Let's go. So next slide. The pursuit of the Confederacy's Western strategy. So the strategy: win the war in the West, get Pacific ports, and so the way to do that was to move into southern New Mexico. There was considerable pro-slavery support there, and there was a certain defection of New Mexico militia officers. The idea was then they were going to move into Colorado as well, and of course let's go to the next slide. When this happens, they formed the Confederate territory. They called it Arizona, but for a while the capital is in Mesilla in southern New Mexico, and it's basically this area. There is a so-called Battle of Mesilla, which is really kind of a skirmish, but the Confederacy was successful. They declared territory. Then they eventually moved to El Paso. Let's go to the next slide. The two main figures in the history of the Civil War in New Mexico are General Sibley, the Confederate, and Canby for the Union. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide, and I want to just drop back for a second to some of the features of the last part of the Compromise of 1850. You see some of those things about slavery continue in California being admitted as a free state. So you see where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada were organized with no mention of slavery. So that's why this area there, we still had a lot of Southern sympathizers. Let's go to the next one. We'll get back to the Civil War right quick. The two big battles are Valverde and Glorieta Pass. Valverde, we go to the next slide. Valverde is, you see the dates there in February. These are considered to be largely Confederate victories after a fashion. Then let's go to the next slide. Battle of Glorieta Pass, also sort of technically a Confederate victory, but the Union supplies were all destroyed. And so that pretty much ended the Confederate occupation of New Mexico. Interestingly enough, when the Confederates occupied Santa Fe and raised the Confederate flag here in Santa Fe, the archives had been moved, the state archives had been moved to Fort Union, had been taken in a wagon because the fear was that the Confederates might destroy the archives. So the archives that we have here now survived the Civil War by leaving Santa Fe, going to Fort Union, and then coming back, which is kind of an interesting story for us. Let's go to the next slide. So the next big thing that happens is in 1863, Lincoln divides the New Mexico territory, and it's more or less then what we have today. And one of the things that's very interesting, very early on, the characters of the two territories are very different in terms of their politics, in terms of the people who live there, and that actually has continued pretty much to the present day. So we had a number of attempts at constitutions on the road to statehood. We already talked about 1850, which actually was successful. We had another one in 1872, another attempt. So let's go to the next slide. And the Constitution in 1872 was actually defeated. Now, there were a lot of people in New Mexico Territory who were not in favor of pursuing statehood. Part of the idea was that it would increase things like taxes. There would be a lot of demands that would put on New Mexico, and it wasn't necessarily a favorable situation. So that attempt at the Constitution was defeated. In 1876, let's look at the next slide. In 1876, there was a statehood bill that came before the Congress. And the 2 years prior, Stephen B. Elkins had introduced an enabling act. And an enabling act is something that all territories that want to become a state have to have an act that gives them permission to create a constitution, and that's called an enabling act. And so Elkins put that through, it passed, and then there was an event that happened which may or may not be true, but it's talked about a lot, and it's called the Elkins handshake. And what happened was Elkins was off the stage, and Representative Burroughs of Michigan was making a speech in favor of the rights of blacks that had been freed, and the Southern people that were in the Congress that were listening to it, of course, were very upset with the provisions of what he was talking about, he wanted to propose. And Elkins supposedly didn't hear the speech. But when it came time for him to go speak, he came on and he shook hands with Burroughs. And when he did that, the Southerners who had been more favorably inclined to vote for New Mexico statehood all decided to vote against it. And also in 1876, an unnamed Southern member of Congress contributed an article to Harper's Weekly. And I want to share just a little bit of what this particular Southerner said about New Mexico. And this is a reaction to the Elkins handshake. He says, and this is quoting in reference to New Mexico, of the present population, which is variously estimated at the last census as 111,000, 9/10 are Mexicans, Indians, greasers, and other non-English speaking people. About 1/10 or 1/11 part of the population speak the English language, and 9/10 are under the strictest Roman Catholic supervision. The proposition of the admission of New Mexico as a state is that such a population in such a civilization of industries and intelligence, and with such forbidding prospects of speedy improvement or increase, a community almost without the characteristics and indispensable qualities of an American state shall have a representation in the National Senate as large as New York, and the House shall be equal to Delaware. It is a virtually ignorant foreign community under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, and neither for the advantage of the Union nor for its own benefit can such an addition to the family of American states be urged. These are objections to a territorial government, but in this case, the territorial supervision supplies encouragement to the spirit of intelligent progress in making the national authority supreme. So there's an awful lot in his comments that was characteristic of what was happening, particularly on the East Coast in opposition. So the idea that there were too many Mexicans, there were too many Indians, they didn't speak English, they were Roman Catholic. In other words, they didn't have share any characteristics with most of the rest of the United States. These arguments are repeated over and over and over. And actually, they had come much earlier. There were even more bigoted comments about New Mexico that didn't happen as early as the 1840s, but that one was in particular in reference to that attempt at that particular time. Now, one thing that's emerging in New Mexico at this also is sort of a distinction that's starting to happen between people who consider themselves Mexican and people who consider themselves Spanish American. Now, we see a reflection of that today, but in the 1880s, you start to see this a lot. And so there begins to emerge a distinctive pride in Nuevo Mexicano Spanish heritage. So this is nothing new. This dates back that far. And part of the idea that was expressed, and this is a lot of in Spanish language newspapers, you see a lot of this in New Mexico, northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. You see this sort of thing. And one of the things is that they're saying we're not mixed blood, and if so, we're just a little bit mixed, and definitely not Indian. And Eusebio Chacon was a real spokesman for this particular attitude, and this was published in 1901 in a Colorado newspaper. He says, "I am Spanish American, as are those who hear me. No other blood circulates through my veins but that which was brought by Don Juan de Oñate and in those illustrious ancestors bearing my name. If any part of Spanish America or in the former Spanish dominion, the purity of physiognomic features of the conquering race has been preserved, it has been in New Mexico. Yes, some degree of mixture has occurred, but slightly, and in only rare cases, such that to say that we are as a community a mixed race is neither proven by historical facts nor withstands scientific analysis." So this idea, and this expresses itself in the fact that, so you have this particular group of people who are saying, basically, we are like all other Americans, we are more European, which is where most everybody else is from, right? And so this group, in arguing for, starts to say, we want to become a state because we are like everyone else. And then you have a lot of Anglo people who are arriving, and so they make the same assessment. This is a different population. The criticism that these people are Mexican is not valid. And so you get that, somewhat surprisingly, the people are characterized when we get down to sort of racial separation for voting purposes. The local population is characterized as white. And so you have this coming from Anglos, also from within that population itself. Okay, so that's that. So in that period, late 1880s, 90s, and then early 20th century, you start to see that. We had, let's go to the next one. And okay, you can go on. So in 1889, we had another constitution. This was presented by Antonio Joseph, and he wanted to have a state. There was an enabling act, and he wanted a state, and it was going to be called Montezuma, state of Montezuma, as opposed to New Mexico. And the people of New Mexico voted fairly overwhelmingly against this constitution, 16,000 against 7,000. So this was not a popular idea, this particular constitution. Okay, so now we're going to move to, let's go to the next slide. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the important figures as we start to move more directly toward it. So, Thomas B. Catron, very controversial figure in New Mexico history, but a very strong proponent of statehood. Obviously wanted to become a state and wanted to be the first senator, which in fact he did become. He was a lawyer. At one point, he was considered to own more land than any other person in the United States. He was very much land rich and money poor. Most of his business things didn't go too well. But anyway, very early statehood advocate and a very prominent figure in that fight. Okay, let's go to the next one. Harvey B. Ferguson, another, he's representative. So as a territory, New Mexico was entitled to representation in the Congress, but not a vote. And so these people that were elected delegate, oftentimes they would serve for a 2-year term. Sometimes they would be reelected, but they would sort of represent the views of New Mexico to the Congress. And Ferguson was one of those. And of course, Ferguson also was instrumental in a lot of other activities here. Most of these people were very prominent people, very, very highly educated individuals. Let's go to the next one. Pedro Perea had been in the legislature here. He serves as a congressional delegate, very highly educated man. He went to St. Mike's, he went to Georgetown, he graduated from St. Louis University. So, you know, he was a cattleman and a banker and all those kinds of things. And so what's happening is that New Mexico is sending these really highly qualified, high successful people to represent New Mexico in Washington. And you know, they're at the same level of preparation of most of the people that are there, sort of countering the idea that this is a very backward place, right? So let's go to the next one. So Governor George Curry, who will serve in the House after statehood, he was a war hero. He served in the Rough Riders. He didn't go to Cuba, but he served with Teddy Roosevelt in the Philippines. And this becomes very important because of the role that Roosevelt is going to play in terms of supporting New Mexico's move to statehood. So let's go ahead and look at the next one. And this is, of course, Roosevelt. Roosevelt was very popular in New Mexico. Many of the Rough Riders that were recruited to go to Cuba were from New Mexico, although many of them never left Florida. But they were still Rough Riders, and for many years, Roosevelt would come here, and there was a Rough Rider reunion that would be in Las Vegas, New Mexico. So he was a very popular figure and a genuine supporter of New Mexico. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. And of course, Taft comes in, and Taft will be the president when statehood happens. So he's really the hero of the story for New Mexicans. Let's go to the next one. I want to finish some of this other local stuff. We bounce back from Washington. You can go to the next slide, if you will. So one of the other delegates, so the delegates were not serving very long. When Rhodey comes in, Rhodey really silenced any opposition in New Mexico.
I know. The only
So-
side of my house that,
Some competition here. Rhodey was an enthusiastic Irishman and one of the most enthusiastic supporters of statehood. So let's go on to the next one. So now there's a lot of support in New Mexico that's sort of generalized. And there's another attempt. People in New Mexico are getting really frustrated. And so there's an attempt in 1902. So they want to try a different idea. So William Knox of Massachusetts introduces a bill, which is the 1902 Omnibus Bill, which is also called the Knox Bill. And the idea with this was that New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma were going to try to all come in at the same time. And it passed in the House, so it looked pretty good for these areas, these territories to become state. And what happened was they said, well, Oklahoma's ready. Oklahoma's prepared, but Arizona and New Mexico, we're not really sure about them. And so let's go to the next slide. So one of the people who comes on the stage to really block New Mexico's statehood is Albert Beveridge, Republican senator from Indiana. Now, he had visited the Philippines, and so he was looking at territories that belonged to the U.S. and their relationship, colonies, territories, all that preparation for statehood, all these types of things. And so he led a subcommittee that came to New Mexico, very influential subcommittee to study the possibility of New Mexico. And he was very hostile to New Mexico. In his committee report, among a number of awful things that he had said, on the whole, the committee feel that in the course of time, when education, now only practically beginning, shall have accomplished its work, when the mass of the people, or even a majority of them, shall in the usages and employment of their daily life have become identical in language and customs with the great body of the American people, when the immigration of English-speaking people who have been citizens of other states does its modifying work with the Mexican element, when all these things have come to pass, the committee hopes and believes that this mass of people, unlike us in race, language, and social customs, will finally come to form a credible portion of American citizenship. So again, very highfalutin language, but basically the same kind of ideas. One of the things that had sort of dropped out by this time, so now we're already barely, but we're in the 20th century, the anti-Catholic rhetoric had sort of started to drop out. Baltimore had emerged as a center of the Catholic Church in America. Baltimore is right there with Washington, and there's a lot of reasons why that sort of rhetoric stops, but you're still getting the idea that they don't speak Spanish. They don't speak English. Well, actually, he says they don't speak Spanish either. He says if the entire population of New Mexico, 33 2/10% are illiterate. That is, they neither read nor write English nor Spanish. So he was considering the entire population was illiterate in both languages. And again, a very prominent member of the Congress. And that was coupled with, let's go to the next slide. So the other individual is Senator Nelson W. Aldrich from Rhode Island, and he was in the position to control committee assignments, and he could decide the bills that made it to the Senate floor. So he was really able, people like this were really able to keep bills that would have um, possibly promoted New Mexico statehood from even being considered. So another idea comes up, starts to be discussed. We haven't been able to make it jointly. What would be the possibility of having Arizona and New Mexico come in as the same state, come in at the same time? And so this is called jointure, there's surveys done in New Mexico, and let's go to the next slide. And I have some quotes from the Carlsbad newspaper in 1903, September of 1903. And the question is asked to people in Carlsbad, as it was to many other places, but it's like, and the simple question, are you in favor of statehood? And what is your opinion of admission with Arizona as one state? So this had been discussed at other times. And the idea again was they were going to revive the idea of it being called Montezuma again. That would be at the same time. So here's some sample of people in Carlsbad, New Mexico, 1903, and their response. Hugh Freeman, a lawyer, says, I have no feeling in the matter. W.M. Kerr, a stockman, I'm against statehood at all. Richard Thorne, manager of a furnishing company. Single states or no statehood at all. A farmer, John Burroughs, I am squarely in favor of single statehood or none. J.R. Joyce, a bank president, I am not in favor of statehood at all. Captain E.P. Bajak, a lawyer, joint statehood would certainly be preferable to none, in my opinion. And A.S. Harris, manager of a bargain store, said, I am certainly in favor of statehood of the bachelor breed. New Mexico voted overwhelmingly for this idea, but Arizona voted very much against it. Let's flip through the next one, which nobody's going to really been able to read. Go ahead. And then the British magazine, Puck, the satirical magazine, that picked up on New Mexico and the next candidate for statehood here. So, dressed very Spanish style, appearing before Lady Liberty there. So let's go to the next one. You'll see the results of the vote. New Mexico was really hot for this idea. Arizona, not so much. And let's go to the next one. So the prime mover of the jointure movement in New Mexico was Holm Burson. Now, of course, he eventually serves as a Senate, but when he's in the Senate in the 20s, he's best known for the infamous Burson bill, which was a bill that was designed to solve the issue of squatters on Native American land. And this was going to regularize the titles of those individuals, and it would have resulted in a massive land loss for Native Americans in New Mexico, particularly Pueblo people, and that was defeated. And that's actually probably what he's best known for, his involvement with the Burson bill, although it wasn't all he ever accomplished. So let's just go to the next one. This is just one more little newspaper thing about, New Mexico being in favor of it and Arizona not. And the people of Arizona just wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with being part of New Mexico, basically. Let's go to the next one. So I mentioned that New Mexico sent, largely highly qualified people that were very important leading citizens. Well, one of the really aggressive supporters of statehood in New Mexico was William Henry Bull Hendricks. He was from Pennsylvania, and he had been involved in banking there. And he was seemed to be making quite a bit of progress toward moving New Mexico to statehood. And then a scandal broke where an individual in the former bank he had been associated with in Pennsylvania committed suicide and left a note to the effect that I think $300,000 had gone missing from the bank, and that Andrews was responsible for it. So the fact that he was involved in this scandal scuttled all the progress that he had made, or most of the progress that he had made towards statehood. Let's go to the next slide. I'll change gears here just a little bit, because there were a lot of different reasons that people tried to stop New Mexico from becoming a state. We've already gone through, sort of the bigoted things, anti-Catholic, various different things. Well, one of the things they also came up with was New Mexico needs to develop hydrologic projects to water the land so that agriculture can develop and the country can really gain something by gaining this desert territory. So an individual, Dr. Nathan Boyd, comes up with a project to dam the Rio Grande in Engle, New Mexico, and of course that's where Alpha Butte Dam is located now. And so the idea was there were competing projects. He wanted to dam the Rio Grande there to water the Mesilla Valley. And of course, that area now is one of the areas where we have industrial scale agriculture in New Mexico, chili, cotton, pecans, and all that, because of the dams that went in. And then there was a competing project. Anson Mills wanted to have it closer to El Paso. He was an El Paso landholder. They both owned land. They wanted to take advantage of watering the land. And so let's go. So the idea, let's go to the next slide. The idea becomes that Boyd is going to put in a dam there. And what happens eventually is that the U.S. government decides that the government is going to put the dam in. And it becomes, the project becomes Alpha Butte Dam. Let's go to the next slide. Of course, named after Alpha Butte here, which is, at this point, this is the camp where they're building, and eventually is surrounded by water. And this is what really starts the New Mexico down the road to what will eventually become the Rio Grande Compact and all the water issues that spring from that. And when the government takes this project over, Nathan Boyd's family is still in the courts. And when this was recently argued in the court, these issues about control of this land and the federal government's involvement, Bureau of Reclamation and all that. And so let's just so you can see the scale of this project. Let's flip next slide. Next slide. You can see now the water is filling it up. At one time, so the dam was completed and opened in 1916. So, but this was also considered very important. The idea of the project from 1909 on was important to New Mexico becoming a state, because they were going to have this. So what happened was this, and when it was constructed, it was the second largest water retention facility in the world. The original Aswan Dam was bigger. Its only purpose is damming water for agriculture. So it doesn't have a no electricity or anything. That was never part of it. And the idea was it would irrigate 200,000 acres. Well, it doesn't irrigate that much, but it did really transform agriculture in the southern part of the state. So what we consider to be the iconic crops, the chili, the cotton, and the pecans and the alfalfa, which all happen to be water hogs as well, really were only possible because of not just Elephant Dam, there's a series of dams, but because this happened. And There were other projects that were proposed for other places in the state, trying to show that New Mexico was capable of being, modern economy and that sort of thing. So let's go to the next one. So 1909, back when the dam was started, we get the introduction of the Enabling Act for New Mexico and Arizona. We've already talked about what that was. That was to give the territory the ability to create a constitution. And so it goes through the Congress, and Taft signs it in 1910, in the middle of the year. And then let's go to the next slide. So then we have a constitutional convention here in Santa Fe. These are the delegates. This constitutional convention was headed by, let's go to the next slide, Charles Speece, a lawyer for San Miguel County. He was had been president of he was president of the convention. So he's also responsible for writing much of the Constitution. Let's go to the next slide. So here's the convention. Here's all the delegates. There were delegates from all over, obviously, all over New Mexico. I think we had one socialist delegate, but others are, Republicans and Democrats. Let's go to the next one. We're going through the process. The constitutional comes to they finish with the Constitutional Convention, and they approve it. Go ahead to the next one. In January of 1910. And they send copies of it all over the place. So let's look at the next one. So what is our Constitution like? How many of you have ever read the New Mexico Constitution? Anyone?
I have it on my.
So you can get a copy. We've probably got copies all over the place. Most secretaries of state will put out an inexpensive copy. It's an interesting read. It really is. So it's a very conservative document. It denied women the right to vote, okay, except for school board. And they missed an opportunity, right? New Mexico missed an opportunity that other states were not doing, that they were already moving beyond this. It evaded the issue of prohibition, which is kind of interesting. It rejected most of the progressive ideas which were associated with national republicanism. So all of those things. And the initial 1910 Constitution was almost impossible to amend. It was modeled to some extent, or maybe to a great extent, after the Constitution of Illinois for some reason. And so this goes to Washington to be examined. Let's go to the next slide. And the issue of initiative, recall, and referendum leads to Taft vetoing the first draft of the Constitution. Let's go to the next one. So they had to adjust it, and they did that by something that's called a blue ballot, which was actually a blue ballot. And they voted on these elements: the less restrictive procedure to amend the Constitution. They put a flood resolution in there. There's the blue ballot. And then this Constitution had to be amended at the state level before it could be effective. So I believe New Mexico has the distinction of having the first amended constitution before it ever was put into effect. I believe of all the states we first that ever had that happen, I believe that's correct. It's still not easy to amend our constitution. It's quite a process. We have had over 100 amendments, but we've also had over 100 years, so not too easy to change. Let's go to the next one. I think I'm running out of time here. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so this little headline. I didn't mean that. I meant only this next one. Statehood on Friday. President will issue proclamation. All this stuff has happened. So let's go to the next one. So January 6, 1912, Statehood Proclamation. Here's Taft signing it, and New Mexico finally has become a state. Let's go to the next slide. And then you just see around the state, Statehood Proclamation signed, inauguration. This will be the inauguration of the first governor, right? Is coming up on January 25th. And the headline says, President Taft affixes his signature to the document that relieves New Mexico of territorial shackles. Enthusiastic delegation at the White House. So territorial shackles, we don't, at this point, New Mexico still can't select its own governor, right? Because the governors in the territory are appointed out of Washington. Let's go to the next one. So New Mexico, this is Las Vegas optic. New Mexico has ceased to be a dependent and is a sovereign state. And again, everybody's all happy about various different newspapers. There was quite a celebration here in New Mexico. Actually, we thought we'd done it when we did the Constitution. We had our blowout celebration was in 1910. Parades all over New Mexico. And of course, that one didn't count. And actually, the real celebration was not quite the blowout that the mistake was. Let's go to the next one. And then New Mexico is a sovereign state of the Union, Albuquerque paper. And then, again, all over the state, all these kinds of things. And then we already have that going on. So then let's go to the next slide. And then we do have our first elected governor, William C. McDonald. New Mexico now, after 65 years, has made it to become a state. Let's go to the next one. And now we have a state capital, which I'm sure you all recognize. Oh, wait, no. Does anybody know what happened to that state capital? Rob, state historian, what happened to that capital?
Well, there was one before that burned, right? Is this the one that they changed, that they took? We still have part of this, don't we? We still go there.
It's unrecognizable what you ever did that.
But it's unrecognizable.
Yeah. So the Bataan building. We have now concluded the road to statehood. I would like to recommend David Holtby's book, The 47th Star, New Mexico's Struggle to Statehood. This is one of the best books that's ever been written about New Mexico history, about any period at all. This is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Everything David writes is great, but this is really outstanding. And I think, rather than, if you still retain some sort of interest in the process, I highly recommend that you read David's book. And I don't know.
I'm sorry, can I have that name again of the book?
David B. Holtby, Holtby, 47th Star.
Thank you, sir.
I guess we could put that, is there a way to put it in the chat?
Yeah, you want to spell
Oh,
it?
here. Here, I'll just let you do it. We'll get our IT whiz to put it in the chat for you folks. And I think we could have time for one question, maybe.
Any questions, comments? Online?
Actually, I was a little curious. I lived in Arizona before coming to New Mexico, and so I'd always kind of been wondering, where did Arizona come from? Is it from the Confederate encroachment into New Mexico, or where?
How do you mean, where did it come from?
Like the actual name of
Oh,
Arizona?
Arizona is where it comes from. It's the name, is Arizona.
Is it Native American?
I don't know the word, and I just know that's where it comes from.
When it first appears around
Yeah.
1863. That's when the Confederacy kind of declared.
That I don't know. Jonathan, I don't know that. We can look it up.
Where was the statehood document signed? Which town?
The statehood document was signed in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Yes.
So in the lead up to statehood,
Mhm.
when you were going through some of the surveys of New Mexicans, you said some of them were not interested in statehood at
Yeah.
all themselves. Why would that be?
So there are a variety of reasons. The tax structure of being a state is very different from being a territory. That was one thing that was that some people. That was one of the ones that sort of an economic argument was one that was made a lot, but it was made by different people. But sometimes a farmer would make that, sometimes a banker would make that argument. Different regulations for banking and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, people just wanted the status quo. They didn't want to have a new relationship. It never seemed to me, to be honest with you, that the reasons for not wanting statehood were anywhere near as compelling. But I know, for example, I wrote a book about a fellow who had moved out here from the Midwest, and he was very adamantly opposed to it because he didn't want to be. He had moved out of the States because he didn't want to live in the United States. He much preferred to live in the territory. I would imagine that it would be similar to an argument that you would get from maybe some other territory, current U.S. territories, that would say they didn't want the relationship. And I think a lot of it is economic. That the transfer, the way I understood it, the transfer of resources from Washington to the territory was infinitely bigger than going the other way, because it was a territory and didn't have all the rights of the state.
We got another one in the chat.
Okay.
What source establishes the Constitution was patterned after the Illinois Constitution?
I can't quote it off the top of my head. I can certainly look at that person wants to email me or something. It is not I'm sure it's not the current Illinois Constitution.
Right.
Right? I mean, I'm sure, and that's just something I remember, and I don't have that in front of me.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you online. Please come back. Thank you, Rick Hendricks, for his informative presentation.
Thank you.